Welcome back, Breanne, to another episode of Not Mythbusters.
Right? Like, we need to hashtag that or trademark it or something, because we can't call this show Mythbusters. But maybe we could call it Not Myth, but no, we wouldn't be able to get away with that. So let's just stick with the Visionary CEO podcast. I'm Breanne Dick. She's Jill Giovinazzo. And I don't know if I love this myth that we're talking about today, or if I hate this myth because of how prevalent it is. But before we get into the myth itself, I kind of have a confession that I need to make.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I know. Jill always gets nervous. I mean, it's not that you don't know all of my foibles and let's call them unique points of view, Jill. But for those listening, it may shock you to hear that I am not a terribly organized person.
Actually, it shocks a lot of people. I've actually had this conversation with some of our clients before, and they have been quite shocked because you come across as being very organized in business.
I don't know. I was going to say in the business. It's mostly, whenever I'm doing videos or I'm doing recordings, there's always a particular angle of my office that we see, because if we were to turn the camera the other direction, I mean, my office is clean now. I cleaned it last weekend, but normally there's a few too many piles of paper. Anyway, let's move on to the actual topic of today's episode. And we're talking today about the myth that you need to have systems and SOPs if you're a creative mess and want to grow your business. And I love this quote. I saw it on Facebook and I thought it was such a perfect description. I resonated with it, at least. And it was, quote, systems. Let's just say my systems are a mess because I'm a creative mess. I need to get clear on what SOPs I need, when I need them, and how to implement them.
Yeah, it sounds familiar for a lot of what clients have said. And honestly, like for all of us, I think we all have our own little messes. It's just that in business, they generally tend to feel like they're a lot bigger than anything else.
Yeah.
And, it reminds me actually quite a bit of a episode that we did last season in season 2, where we were talking with Keela about her business and about the growth that she had been going through.
Yeah, raise your hand. Not that I can see it, but if you're listening to this, raise your hand if you've ever felt exhausted and like you're a creative mess. And like the only solution to this is to hire someone and then write an SOP for them, or write an SOP so that you can hire someone. I think,
and that's the common. Well, I'm just going to call it out. That's the common myth that gets told, is that you
Right.
have to have SOPs in order to get all of the things done properly and to make sure things don't fall through the cracks.
I think that's really what it comes down to is, it's one thing to have SOPs because you want to hire someone. But really what I hear so often is, this idea of either I'm a visionary or I have just got too much going on, or, things are a mess. I need to get clear on what the details are. And at the root of it, there's this belief that if I don't have this written down somewhere, if I don't have this process step by step for someone to write down or for someone to follow, that either things won't get done the way I want them to, which we normally define as having it done properly, or they might be done properly, but then things are going to fall through the cracks. And so I think there's a lot legitimate about that, right? In terms of those fears that you bring more people on, you grow your team, and things won't get done the way that you would do them, or things will fall through the cracks because, maybe now you got 2 or 3 people doing something that you previously had been doing all on your own. But the critical thing for us to really dig into is, are SOPs the right solution to what is a very real problem?
Yeah. And the thing that always comes up for me when I hear this, and and how many people actually say, SOPs are what you need to do, is that so often I see people creating SOPs and things still fall through the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah. Or things aren't done properly or whatever. Right. And I think, you and I have talked at length about this, and it's maybe a topic for this conversation, maybe a topic for a future conversation, that, there's a difference between an SOP, which gives someone a result to focus on, as opposed to a checklist and how to that details out all of the little itty bitty steps to follow. But what I think is so interesting about that is it's like things start getting out of control or feeling out of control, and our instinct is to try and put more control onto them. So put more detail in the SOP or get more specific in the how-to. And what I've seen is that just creates bigger problems.
Yeah, for sure. And, when you're doing that and you're getting into that kind of articulation, let's call it, right? That granular level, right? We're essentially kind of diving back into, and we talked about this in season 1 when we were talking about the team structure. You essentially get back into delegating tasks rather than asking people to take ownership of a responsibility. Yeah. Because when we're talking about that kind of level, right, we're talking about telling them how to do the work rather than giving them the result, the what, that we want them to accomplish.
And I think that's ultimately why we do see people having checklists, having to-dos, having tasks. You can call them SOPs if you want. But at the end of the day, things still fall through the cracks, because it's almost like the more details you put in, the more cracks there are. Or the more steps you put in a process, like you have to do A, then you have to do B, then you have to do C, then you do D. Between A and B, there's a crack. Between B and C, there's a crack. Between C and D, there's a crack. And you're just, by putting in all this more detail, you're actually putting in more places for things to potentially go wrong. Because what happens if A doesn't lead to B, and the person that you've hired doesn't know, they're not equipped to handle that situation because they were expecting it to all just to go A, B, C, D without issue.
Yeah. I actually had a very similar conversation with another of our clients recently for this exact reason. Is they have all of their processes, how they handle their marketing, how they handle, podcast creation and social media creation, all of it's documented, right? All of it has SOPs, and even down to the level of how-tos, they have them both. But what they're missing and where things are falling down is in that transition between them, right? And it's that lack of, not just the lack of understanding of what leads to the next thing, but it's also, I think of it, I kind of come back to my computer science and mathematics background, and I think of it as a trigger, right? Or if you've done some of the marketing funnels or been in some of the marketing automation software out there, right? The goal or the trigger that starts off a process or ends a process.
The if this, then that.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so often when we create these SOPs, we hit the end of the SOP, we hit the end of the result, but we don't talk about in the SOP what it leads to next, or what it could be triggered by, or what in the beginning of the SOP, what it starts off from, right? And so you don't have, essentially, I'm going to use one of my favorite pieces, you don't have a flow chart of how everything comes together.
See, and here you're talking like logic and math and programming and flow charts, and I was going to go with a sports analogy, and I was going to say that you've got handoffs, right? Like in football, where you're going to hand the ball off to someone and the ball gets dropped. It gets fumbled because the handoff wasn't clean. So I'm the quarterback. I have the ball. I do my part, but then I turn to give the ball to the running back, and there's a disconnect between us. We're not both in the right place. We're not moving at the right speed. We're not moving at the same speed. I try and give them the ball, and all of a sudden, the ball's on the turf. The other team takes it, and it's down in our end zone for 6 points against, right?
We're presuming that most of our listeners understand football, and we're talking the American/Canadian version, not the English.
Yeah, or the international, not just English. Anywhere other than Canada or the US, yes. American football or Canadian football. Anyway, the point still stands, which is, you have all of these things that need to get done, and whether it's cracks like between the major units, like there's an SOP for onboarding a client, and then there's an SOP for setting up their folder system, and then there's an SOP for making sure that they are getting the right emails or whatever it happens to be. There can be cracks between those. But even within those, what happens is that you get so granular with the details that the entire thing becomes rigid and unmoving and unflexible. And the world doesn't always operate predictably.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because not only that, but it's essentially when we start to get that granular, we start to get that detailed, we're also too, in a way, disempowering our team and causing them to feel like they have to get that level of detail from us in all cases in order to do the work.
And this is something, again, back to this idea of delegation, right? We're constantly telling people how to do their job. They come to expect that they should be told how to do it. And so the taking initiative, the thinking of different ways to do things, the creative problem solving that we so desperately want from our team members, we actually condition that out of them because we're telling them the details of how to do this stuff. And it ends up that they're disempowered. They're not able to bring their full genius to work. And we keep getting pulled back in the weeds because whenever they have a question, their default is to come to us for an answer instead of figuring out the solution for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And then what ends up happening is that we as entrepreneurs, as the leaders in the business, get frustrated with the end result because they're not doing those things, right? Or even if they were at the time, at the start of the cycle, and things fall through the cracks, we get frustrated. They try and adhere further, we get more frustrated, and it creates this cycle. And satisfaction and enjoyment and just overall possibility in the business, in the role, in the opportunities that you're provided with go down.
Yeah. I mean, how can you innovate if your job is to follow a checklist?
Yeah.
In fact, that's what a checklist specifically tells you not to do, is don't innovate. And so often what happens, I hear people saying, I want my team to be innovating. I want them to be taking charge. I want them to be bringing new ideas to the table. How do I do that? And then at the same time, like, you turn around and you look at what they're actually doing in their business, and everything they've set up in terms of SOPs and systems is designed to completely take room for all innovation out of the picture entirely.
Now, I will grant that there is an aspect in here that we're kind of talking around, and this is the aspect that is, as one of our clients calls it, the mental gunk, around giving up control of these pieces to our team members. And that's a whole other piece of the ball. But I just want to address that, or just bring it up here, that there is that also weighs in on all of this, where we're seeing it, and I tell the story all the time about Breanne and myself, and when I was first really working in the business, and the whole concept of a plan and how it didn't match up. The result that Breanne was expecting didn't meet the result that I was giving, right? But when we're looking at this, right, if we're not able to, as leaders, to give up control over how the work is accomplished and allow our people to meet the result that we've defined for, however it works best for them, then we also get stuck. Yeah. And I just wanted to bring that up and just flag that as something that is a challenge for a lot of people.
Well, because we're not we're not in the business of creating widgets. And I think that's the thing that's really important to realize is if we're creating widgets where every situation is the same, we need to have, the production has certain tolerances, it needs to be exactly produced the right way, then yes, you need checklists. I want my surgeon and I want my airline pilot to be going through the checklists to make sure that like they're doing their pre-flight checks or that they're closing me up after surgery properly, right? Like there's a role for those things. But when we're dealing as most coaches and consultants, and even, if you got a course or something like that, we're dealing with human to human interaction. We're dealing with things that we can't constrain and we can't control all of the variables. And so when we try to systematize and SOPize every little thing, we're actually undermining the integrity of the entire process. Not to mention creating bottlenecks all over the place because everything has to be done according to the process. And if you either don't have a process or the situation doesn't fit the process, you have to wait until it gets resolved.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I think at this point we should let Keela jump back in here because this is ultimately the realization that she came to as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, if it's not SOPs and it's not processes, then what is it? Right. That's the question.
That's ultimately what it comes down to. And we've been kind of talking around this a little bit, but there's two main concepts that we talk a lot about that I think are relevant here. And the first is the idea of the core process. So if you don't know what the core process is, you can head back to season 1, episode 5 talks about it. It's where your results and your delivery kind of combine into what happens. But the idea of the core process is that it's an overall view of all of the major activities that happen in the business. If you want, you can almost think of it as a table of contents of what could potentially be SOPs, right? So if you were to think of you could have a whole bunch of SOPs, but what's more important actually is to have that table of contents of these are all the things that happen, so that at the very least, I know that I'm doing this piece and that the next thing that happens is that piece, and that I need to make sure that those two things are connected. That's how we solve this things falling through the cracks problem, is we have to have this core process that maps out how do all of these pieces connect to each other at the first place.
Yeah. And, we talk about it in season 1 with specific attention to our results structure and the delivery model. And I just want to articulate here that it's not just about product when we're talking about this, right? We can actually fold in marketing and sales goes in this kind of results and delivery model kind of variant itself, because those also have results that we're trying to go for. Those also have an experience that we're trying to give our clients.
Yeah.
Right. And as such, they have that same, or they need to have that same table of contents of how does one thing follow another.
Yeah. So I'm thinking
what?
Yeah, of what happens. And I think that's the important thing. And in our business, we have a page in our project management system, which essentially is here's what happens, then here's what happens, then here's what happens, then here's what happens, then here's what happens. Not at the level of checklist, but more at the level of, a customer sees the application form and submits it. The team reviews the application and either accepts or rejects. Then the client either buys or they don't. Then we set up for their onboarding. Then they have an onboarding call, right? This is the higher level. It's not the detail of the SOP. It's the next level up from that in terms of the overall flow. And that goes all the way. I started at the application, but it could go all the way back to how marketing is created. This podcast is a step in our core process. And it can go all the way on the other end through to How do we handle referrals? How do we handle alumni? And even things like HR processes. How do we onboard new team members, right? All of those things are pieces of this core process that we want to know even what those pieces are, not so that we can create the SOPs for them, but so that we can give ownership of the pieces to the right person on the team. And that's the second concept, right? The core process is one, but ownership is the second piece of the puzzle here.
Yeah, exactly. And this comes back to the what rather than the how, right? Giving your team the outcome, the result, not the checklist of how to accomplish them, right? Let them figure out how to accomplish it. That's why we hired them in the first place, is because they have experience, because they have background in this. Yeah. And depending on their background, they may approach it. Two different people could approach the exact same outcome and result differently, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Right?
And over time, they will find good ways to do things and better ways to do things. And, as your business grows, I think I was reading, what was the book? I think it's Ready, Fire, Aim by Masterson. And yes, that is the correct title. It's not Ready, Aim, Fire. It's Ready, Fire, Aim, I think, by Masterson. And he says that it's really only when you get to about 3 million that you should even start thinking about SOPs. And the reason for that is because there's too much that's changing. There's too much that's iterating and evolving and growing. And so that's why I'm such a strong advocate, as is Jill, of yes, have your core process, have that documented, but you shouldn't be worried about the details of what happens in each of those. Instead, that should be for your team to figure out and let them standardize it, because they're the people who are doing it and experts in it anyway.
Yeah. And just to reiterate, one other reason why it's so key to focus on this outcome piece rather than on the how. And it comes back to this idea of stop recreating the wheel, right? Oftentimes, especially when we start focusing on the how, right, we stop recognizing that in the end, we're still making a decision, right? And the point of an SOP is to make the decisions ahead of time and just replicate it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Whereas
and
if we get...
those decisions will evolve.
Yeah.
Right? Those decisions will evolve as the business evolves, as our team grows, as they get better, as our clients become even better fits for us. All of these things will cause these SOPs, these processes to grow and evolve. And so that's ultimately, to me, what an SOP is. An SOP isn't something that's locked down in stone of this is how we do this. Instead, it's no matter what the details are, this is what we want to accomplish, and the details will change and get better as we get better at doing it.
I actually want to give you a really off-the-wall example that is a perfect example for an SOP in a business that most won't consider an SOP. A job description.
Okay, tell me more.
Right? A job description is a listing of what's. It's a listing of outcome success measures that we are asking our people to take responsibility, to take ownership of, right? And it'll be a listing of frequency. You can almost even think of it as the kind of almost that higher level table of contents.
Yeah. What are the sorts of things you should be doing weekly? What are the sorts of things you should be doing monthly? Not go and check in Asana to see what all the tasks are, but make sure that projects are on track every week, right? Like that level is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's a really great example of what we're talking about, what an SOP really needs to be from that perspective of results and outcome focused and ownership.
Well, and I think that is such a good point, and it leads into, off of Keela's clip off the top where she was talking about, I just want someone who can come in and get to speed quickly. What does it actually mean to be up to speed? Well, for most of it means I want someone that I don't have to be telling them what to do. I don't have to be monitoring them and managing them and getting into the weeds with them. And that was the experience that Keela shared with us last season in our conversation, that as soon as she shifted away from SOPs and more toward this idea of ownership, things got off her plate way faster.
Really fast.
Exactly. Right? It's like, that's what we want. It's like, I don't need you to teach me how to do this. I got it. That's the feeling that I'm looking for. And that's what makes me feel like I can trust my team. And like, I don't need these checklists because they're doing the thing and I don't need to check up on them. I don't need to be spending all my time in the project management tool or reading all the emails that went out to the clients to make sure they said the right thing, right? And that for me is the sign that I'm doing this right, that I've got it right, and that I've hit the right balance between giving the what but not the how. So I mean, that's kind of the myth and the solution to the myth. But Jill, you coach our clients through this pretty much every day. If you had to give someone a simple step in terms of how can they actually implement this, what's something they could do today that would help them make this transition, what would you suggest that they do?
It's a really great question. And to be honest, the smallest step is just to find something that you have sort of delegated, right? Not even fully transition ownership of, but you've delegated it over, you've given over the task. And to take that and to sit down with that person that you've given that task to and like ask them how they would prove it, ask them how they would do it differently, ask them what do they need to be able to take over ownership. If I give you this result, if I say really clearly, this is what I want this to actually end up as, do you have everything that you need to do this?
Yeah. And then they can take that.
Yeah, exactly. If they do, then they can take that and they can run with it and they can create the what documents that we've been talking about.
Yeah. They can create whatever checklists they need. They can share that with other team members. But it's no longer about, oh, I need to create all of these SOPs and then I need to hire all these people and I need to get, right? It's not about that. It's about having the conversation about how would you do this? How could you make it better? And then letting them own it. So that, I think, is a really good place to leave this conversation. The myth that you need SOPs, the myth that if you don't have them, you're just going to stay a creative mess. When the truth is, if you have that core process and then you give ownership to your team and let them define the how, you will free yourself up so much more and your life will get better so much faster. And it's just, it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing.
And your team is just going to love it.
Yeah.
Because they have the empowerment now to go and do what you hired them to do in the first place.
Yeah. All right. So that's what we've got for you today. We're going to sign off of this episode. Thank you for joining us. As always, we're coming to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. We'll be here next week again for another episode of the Visionary CEO podcast. We can't wait to see you then.